Chapter 2. As it turned out, Rue had an uncle. He didn't come for her right away, though. He was traveling, she was told, and no one could get in touch with him. In the meantime, Rue was placed in a foster home with a Mr. and Mrs. Burrow. She was wedged into a room with 3 other foster girls whom she instantly hated. They hated her right back. She tried to stay clear of them, finding hiding places throughout the house. They hunted her down for sport, but rarely found her. One afternoon, in the brambly corner of the garden, she found a dilapidated greenhouse where Mrs. Burrow started his tomato plants. Rue sat on a bag of fertilizer, watching a spider spin its web. Its tiny legs fretted and fussed with the webbing. It reminded her of the way her father's fingers looked when he picked at his guitar listlessly while waiting for something to happen. A phone call, a knock on the door. Long, elegant fingers. Fingers that seemed to be on the wrong person's hand. Suddenly, the greenhouse door was yanked open, and the 2 older foster girls appeared. Rue looked up at them briefly. Then her eyes slid back to the spider. "Your uncle isn't coming, you know," one of the girls said. "They told him what a jerk you are, and he said, 'No thanks, you can keep her.'" "I don't care if he comes or not," Rue said. They tried a different approach. "Your parents were drug dealers." So, the girl fumbled. "So, you'll grow up bad too. It's in the blood." "I might," Rue said. The girls did not know what to do with Rue. She never responded the way she should. In the end, they left her alone, but in a fit of pique, they padlocked the greenhouse door. It didn't matter. She watched the spider finish her web and afterwards easily crawled through a loose pane of glass in the roof. Rue's uncle did come to fetch her, although he didn't come himself. Instead, he sent his personal assistant. Miss Valentine was slim and handsome, though not young. She had dark hair, fine pale skin, and an aquiline nose. Although she was primly dressed in tweed pants, a black wool coat, and a black cardigan, she wore a peculiar purple hat that was shaped like a thimble and wrapped with a brown velvet ribbon above the brim. She eyed Rue's hefty bag full of clothes with distaste before she put it up on the train's luggage shelf, shoveling it into the compartment with her fingertips. As she did, Rue slipped by her and tucked herself into the window seat. "Don't expect a view," Miss Valentine warned, staring down at Rue. "It's backyards and scrubby bits all the way." She waited for Rue's face to register disappointment, but the faded green eyes stared back at her coolly. Strange girl, Miss Valentine thought. She doesn't look as if she ever shed a tear. Miss Valentine removed her coat before she sat down, folding it neatly in her lap. And on top of that, she placed her extraordinary hat. Then, with no jolt at all, the train moved smoothly out the station. "How old are you?" Miss Valentine asked stiffly, after a time. 12. She turned to look at ruefully now, the first time she had done so since she picked her up at the Burrows' house. "That's what they told us, but you seem too small for 12, she pronounced. "Is there something the matter with you?" "Is there something the matter with you?" Rue shot back. "Now, there's no need for touchiness at Cough Rock, young lady," Miss Valentine warned. "What's that?" Rue asked. "Cough Rock?" "Your uncle's place." She glanced at Rue quickly and sighed. "You should be warned, I guess. It's an odd place. You aren't a nervous type, are you?" Rue shook her head. "Well, we'll find out soon enough," she said, doubtfully. "The house is large, but you are not to go poking around. Do you understand? Your uncle will be very angry. He has laid down rules, and we all follow them. You will too." Miss Valentine rubbed her thumb against her hat's ribbon. After a moment, she added in a more gentle tone, "Of course, we are sorry about your loss. Your uncle adored your father, you know. He tells me they were very close, back when they were boys. I met your father once, years ago. He was wild and foolish, but he was—" Miss Valentine paused. Rue looked up at her. For the first time that day, she was interested in what Miss Valentine had to say. "I think he had a good heart, underneath. Miss Valentine concluded. It was what Rue had hoped to hear. It was what she had felt about him herself, though no one else seemed to share that opinion. Her father was by turns considered a drug dealer, a shady character, a loser. Still, Miss Valentine's words made her feel worse somehow. I was very sad to hear about his death, Miss Valentine said. Your mother's, too, of course, she added. It was her own fault, Rue said simply. She turned away to stare out the dirt-flecked window. Miss Valentine's tidy brow furrowed at this. Strange girl, she thought for the second time, but now it was more of a verdict. And she wasn't my mother, Rue added suddenly. She was just his girlfriend. Really? Miss Valentine turned to Rue, her voice rising with sudden interest. You have a mother? Where is she? Rue shrugged. The conductor approached, and Miss Valentine turned away from Rue to hand the man their tickets. He stamped holes in them and shoved them into the metal holder above the seats. What's your mother's name? Miss Valentine pursued after the conductor left. Rue shrugged. What do you mean? Miss Valentine imitated Rue's shrug and scowl. You don't know your own mother's name? She was just another girlfriend. She didn't want me. My father did. That's all I know. They rode in silence for a while. The train was quiet, not as rattly as Rue had imagined it would be. It slid along the rails, bellying from side to side, so that these two stiff creatures bumped against each other occasionally and pretended they hadn't. After some time, Miss Valentine spoke again. I suppose you've heard all sorts of nonsense about your uncle. No, Rue said. She turned to Rue. Well, what have you heard? Nothing, Rue said. Your father must have told you something about him. I didn't know I had an uncle. Really? Miss Valentine gave the hat a little joggle. Well, she said, her voice sounding more businesslike, then here's what you should know about your uncle. You are not to upset him. You are not to pester him. You are not to ask him questions. Questions about what? She asked. About anything at all, Miss Valentine warned sharply. He agreed to take you in, and that's all you need to know. He feels very guilty about your father, although I don't see why he should. Your father left home at 15, wanted to do things his own way, so I'm told, and his father washed his hands of him, money and all. Your uncle tried to track your father many times, but he couldn't find him. We moved around, Rue muttered. In fact, they moved every few months, whenever her father would get in trouble with the law. They had stayed in the pit longer than any other place, nearly a year. Well, I hope he managed to keep you in school while he was moving you hither and thither. Sometimes. Sometimes? Miss Valentine exclaimed. In fact, they had moved around so much that she often missed long stretches of school, much to her relief. She hated school. Not the books and the learning part. Her mind was quick enough. What she hated was being forced to be around other kids. At every new school she went to, the kids made fun of her dirty, worn-out clothes and her wild-looking hair. She had defied them by letting herself grow more wild until she looked so frightening that no one would come near her. And that suited her just fine. There was a small plastic table that was latched flat against the seat in front of her. Rue flicked the latch carelessly with her index finger, causing the table to slam down loudly. The man in front of her turned to frown at her, as did Miss Valentine. Rue swung her legs up and rested her sneakers on the table. Feet off! Miss Valentine hissed, with disgust at Rue's sneakers. People eat on that table. It made Rue look at her feet more closely. The plastic soles of her sneakers were peeling up, and the once white tops were now gray. The bottom of her pants were shredded from being too long and constantly stepped on. She felt Miss Valentine's eyes on her feet, too. That made her mad, so she kept her sneakers on the table. If you become too much trouble, Miss Valentine cautioned, you'll be sent straight back to the burrows. That's a promise. It's a madness for your uncle to take you on. I told him so. She waited another moment for Rue to move her legs. When She didn't. Miss Valentine snuffled loudly through her fine, narrow nose. Then she rummaged through her bag, making the thick charm bracelet on her wrist chime, until she retrieved a copy of the New York Times and a store-bought yogurt parfait with a plastic spoon. She settled back into her seat, snapped the paper open, and from then on she pretended Rue no longer existed. That was fine with Rue. For the rest of the trip, Rue watched the passing stretches of dreary brown hills and bare trees, their branches cross-hatched against the cold gray sky. Occasionally they passed towns that looked much like Limpet, with their lopsided houses and scrappy backyards, until they vanished, giving way to long stretches of woods. It might have made most people feel both wistful and frightened. But for Rue, who understood things in terms of space, feeling wistful about the past and nervous about the future was too much like standing alone and exposed in acres of open field. It was unsafe. Instead, she tucked her mind into a smaller thought. What was it that her uncle did not want her to ask about? Rue's father and his girlfriend, Jolie, had secrets, but they kept them very poorly. They fought too loudly, and all their troubles spilled out like an ugly mess. But most adults, Rue suspected, would be more careful. Was her uncle involved in something illegal, like her father? It seemed unlikely that a criminal would have a personal assistant, and it seemed even more unlikely that someone like Miss Valentine would work for a criminal. Or maybe there was something wrong with him. Maybe he had a violent temper, like Jolie. At least if it was a big house, she could find places to hide. The train turned sharply, and the late afternoon sun flooded the car. Miss Valentine shielded her face with her hat. Rue closed her eyes and slipped her hand into her jacket pocket to feel the cool smoothness of the little glass snake. It was so thin that she could have snapped it in half between her fingers. Another possibility occurred to her then, one that struck her as by far the most interesting. Maybe her uncle was exactly like her. Maybe he simply wanted to be left alone. Rue had never understood the strange attraction people had for one another. It baffled her the way people always herded up, endlessly talking. What on earth did they have to say to each other? Rue's father liked to talk, but with him it was different. He didn't care if you spoke back. He just knew the sort of things that people liked to hear and told it to them in his dreamy, slow way. Every so often someone would call him charming. "Let's see him charm the bars off his cell," Jolie had said as she stood at the top of the trailer steps and watched the police car haul him off one night. She laughed, the little metal stud on her tongue glistening off the police car's headlights. But he was back home the following day, looking tired with a bruise on his cheekbone, but otherwise no worse for it. No matter what sort of trouble he got into, he had always managed to slip out of it, until a few weeks ago. Thinking about her father made Rue's chest ache. She forced her mind to collapse down again until it was narrow as a squint, just wide enough to numbly watch the miles and miles of dull brown views out the window, and to wonder what sort of place Cough Rock would be.